The first signs of dread began when investigators opened the sealed metal container and found, resting atop decades of preserved memorabilia, a single envelope addressed to no one yet marked with a date that had not arrived. The air inside the container carried a faint metallic chill, and the moment the letter was lifted, every seasoned instinct in that archival room shifted toward something profoundly wrong. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, and so strangely calm for what it revealed that the investigators paused, sensing that the discovery would reroute a long-dormant case and expose a truth buried beneath years of winter quiet. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. In December 1998, Baltimore wore its familiar mixture of brick-lined history and early winter steel skis. The holiday lights began drifting into windows along Charles Street, and the harbor carried its usual cold wind across the docks. For many residents, the season carried the comfort of routine, the anticipation of gatherings, and the slow approach of a new year. Yet for one family in the northeast edges of the city, the season had not held that warmth for years. Their daughter, missing since the winter of 1983, existed only through aging flyers in storage boxes, fading ink in old police summaries, and a small set of belongings archived in the evidence room. The case had drifted across decades with no formal resolution, eventually filed among the quiet, unsolved disappearances that still lingered in Baltimore's law enforcement memory. The woman at the center of that case was 22-year-old Emily Harrow, a student who divided her time between community college coursework and a part-time position at a small record shop on York Road. She was last seen during the week following Thanksgiving 1983, on a night when early snow drifted across the sidewalks, dusting the narrow roads and storefront awnings. Her absence at work the next morning drew the first concern. Her family called police later that day, and within hours, search efforts began stretching through the neighborhood's side streets, wooded edges, and bus routes. That initial wave of urgency generated several interviews, a handful of potential sightings, and a carefully documented timeline that held together with a fragile precision. But nothing led to her location. In the weeks that followed, the holidays arrived against a backdrop of worry that overshadowed every seasonal ritual. Police expanded their radius of inquiry, and community volunteers handed out flyers near shopping centers filled with Christmas displays and carols echoing from storefront speakers. There were no confirmed leads. The investigation continued into early January 1984, with the same methodical approach typical of the Baltimore Police Department at the time. Detectives reviewed her academic records, employment logs, and social associations. They compiled the names of anyone who had interacted with her during the final days before her disappearance. The case soon intersected with the cold, clinical structure of forensic documentation, clothing descriptions, the last known time of phone usage, the contents of her backpack left in her apartment, and a calendar marked with upcoming exams and work shifts. Everything presented the picture of a routine young adult life interrupted without explanation. Despite the detailed record-keeping, no trace of Emily surfaced. Her file eventually moved from active rotation into the growing archive of unresolved cases. By the late 1990s, new investigative leadership in Baltimore began revisiting older cases using updated analytical methods. Paper records were re-examined, and evidence boxes, some sealed for more than a decade, were reopened in hopes that improvements in forensic science might reveal previously undetectable clues. Among these efforts was the review of municipal time capsules, a project initiated by a local historical society eager to catalog and preserve items from the 1980s for the approaching millennium. When one particular capsule, sealed in 1984 and stored for years in a seldom-used municipal basement, was opened. Investigators were present only as observers. The capsule contained predictable items: local newspapers, school brochures, photographs from holiday parades, and letters written by students predicting Baltimore's future. But tucked inside a plain envelope was something that did not match the tone of the rest. The letter, written in precise cursive, contained reflections on guilt and regret, including veiled references to an incident near the end of 1983. Most striking was the mention of a young woman, described in terms consistent with Emily's disappearance. Once investigators identified the potential relevance of the letter, they transported it to the evidence unit for controlled review. The timing alone raised questions. The capsule had been sealed approximately 6 months after Emily went missing. Its contents were cataloged by volunteers and city officials, none of whom reported receiving or placing an envelope of that nature. The writing style suggested an adult author, not a student or a casual participant in the project. The idea that someone had chosen a time capsule, of all places, to deposit an anonymous confession forced a reevaluation of every assumption made about the case. Investigators began reconstructing community involvement with the capsule's creation, mapping out who had access to it, where it had been stored, and the context surrounding its assembly. The process was quiet, deliberate, and carried out in the subdued winter offices of the police headquarters, where holiday decorations now contrasted sharply with the gravity of an unexpected lead. As detectives re-examined the original case file, they noted several key individuals whose whereabouts and statements had been documented in 1983. Among them was a local man who had been interviewed only briefly after Emily's disappearance. His name appeared in the early logs because he had been a volunteer for several community events that season, including holiday drives and public school activities. Nothing in his original interview raised suspicion, and he presented a clean timeline for the night Emily went missing. However, his involvement in the creation of the 1984 time capsule placed him directly within the circle of individuals who could have accessed it. Detectives cross-referenced signatures from event rosters, community meeting attendance lists, and handwritten notes preserved from the capsule's planning committee. The writing in the anonymous letter carried similarities to some of the handwritten volunteer forms submitted by the same man. Although handwriting analysis lacked the evidentiary conclusiveness of modern DNA or fingerprint comparison, it provided a preliminary lead. The investigative approach expanded into a broader re-examination of Emily's final known movements. Records from the record shop where she worked indicated that inventory logs had been updated that week, and a shipment receipt timestamped around the time she was last seen had required signatures from both staff and vendors. In 1983, many such documents were handwritten. Detectives retrieved archived commercial records from warehouses that had stored old business filings, some of them kept in deteriorating boxes near the edges of long rows of shelving. The December air inside these facilities carried a cold stillness that mirrored the decades-long pause in the case. Among the papers, a set of vendor logs contained signatures in the same handwriting style as the letter from the capsule. The discovery subtly shifted the investigation, connecting the anonymous envelope not just to a participant in the community project, but to someone whose work placed him near the record shop during the critical window before Emily's disappearance. Media coverage resurfaced in late December 1998 as Baltimore news outlets caught wind of renewed attention to the case. Reporters crafted stories that reflected both the solemnity of the situation and the cautious hope that modern investigative work might finally provide closure. Old photographs of Emily circulated again, showing her in winter clothing during past holidays, a reminder of the life interrupted during a season typically filled with gatherings and light. Her family, though aged and quiet in their public statements, acknowledged that the passage of time had not dissolved the need for answers. Investigators continued to reconstruct the timeline through interviews with former coworkers, many of whom recalled the atmosphere of that winter, early dark evenings, the hum of seasonal music in the shop, and the routine presence of delivery personnel navigating the area. While memories had faded, some recollections aligned with previously overlooked patterns. Several individuals remembered a particular vendor representative who often lingered near the shop longer than necessary, though nothing overtly concerning had been noted at the time. Such details, once too minor to pursue, now assumed new importance. The holiday season of 1998 added its own backdrop to the renewed investigation. Snowstorms passed intermittently through Baltimore, coating the city in quiet layers that softened traffic sounds and slowed daily movement. Detectives used this seasonal lull to process and compare documents in controlled laboratory settings. Under specialized lighting, the letter from the capsule revealed pressure patterns and pen strokes consistent with the vendor logs. Although not definitive on their own, these findings supported the decision to gather supplementary evidence. Every step adhered to procedural rigor, ensuring that the case's reactivation would withstand legal scrutiny should it progress toward formal action. By the end of the year, investigators had developed a structured profile of the individual whose handwriting connected multiple documents. The letter from the capsule, the vendor signatures, and the volunteer records formed a cohesive evidentiary trail. Each piece, reviewed under forensic standards available at the time, contributed to an emerging picture of opportunity, proximity, and intent surrounding the night Emily vanished. The case, once stagnant, now moved with a measured momentum through the cold corridors of Baltimore's winter-bound institutions. As the investigation entered January 1999, the cold winter atmosphere around Baltimore matched the restrained urgency shaping the renewed case strategy. Detectives divided their efforts between analyzing archival documents and reconstructing the physical spaces connected to Emily's final days. The neighborhood she once moved through had changed across the years, yet remnants of the past remained in the layout of the streets, the aging storefronts, and the older commercial buildings that still carried the faint echo of 1980s routines. Investigators visited these locations not in search of overlooked physical evidence. Too much time had passed, but to reaffirm the spatial relationships between her workplace, her apartment, and the surrounding businesses. Such steps contributed to a clearer understanding of the movements of individuals who regularly entered the area, particularly the man whose handwriting appeared linked to the letter found in the time capsule. Detectives interviewed former members of the 1984 Capsule Committee, many of whom recalled the excitement of preserving community memories for future generations. The capsule had been intended as a symbolic moment of optimism following a recession-era stretch of civic challenges. Volunteers gathered items reflecting everyday life, school essays, winter festival programs, and personal notes. The man of interest, identified through old rosters, was remembered only as a quiet contributor who assisted with collecting materials. His presence did not stand out in any unusual way at the time. But when interviewed again in 1999, long after aging records placed him within the circle of relevance, investigators noted inconsistencies in his recollections. He minimized his involvement with the capsule, despite signatures confirming his participation. His explanation for the discrepancy was vague, attributing memory lapses to the passage of time. While not incriminating, The inconsistency solidified his placement on the investigative timeline. During this period, forensic specialists continued examining the letter from the capsule. The paper quality matched stationery produced in the early 1980s, commonly sold in local shops. Ink analysis identified characteristics consistent with pen types widely available in Baltimore during that era. These results did not provide exclusivity, but narrowed the context in which the letter could have been created. The deliberate phrasing within the message, its references to an irreversible night, and a desire for hidden confession, guided investigators toward a theory that the author believed the capsule would remain sealed long enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. Such behavior suggested premeditation in concealing the letter among benign community artifacts. The investigation soon expanded into the man's employment history. Records confirmed his role as a regional representative for a distribution company that regularly serviced retail sites, including the record shop where Emily worked. Delivery routes placed him near the shop on multiple occasions during the week of her disappearance. Archived route logs revealed a delivery scheduled on the exact date she was last confirmed present. Inspection of these documents, preserved in warehouse archives, provided more than circumstantial connections. The signatures on several logs exhibited the same handwriting patterns found on the envelope from the time capsule. The convergence of these details gave investigators the necessary foundation to secure a warrant for obtaining updated exemplars and further personal documentation. When confronted with requests for handwriting samples, the man complied but displayed visible discomfort. Investigators carefully compared the samples against the archived documents. While handwriting analysis alone could not serve as conclusive evidence, the similarities were assessed as statistically significant by experts familiar with mid-1990's comparison methodologies. Combined with timeline placement and shifts in the man's statements over repeated interviews, suspicion grew in a structured, legally supported direction. As winter progressed, the case began drawing renewed public attention. Local news outlets aired retrospective segments revisiting the original disappearance, often accompanied by the somber imagery of aging newspaper clippings and the early 1980s search efforts. The public was reminded of the cold evenings when volunteers combed wooded edges near residential zones and distributed flyers at malls decorated with garlands and holiday banners. Some of those volunteers now stepped forward with new reflections, offering recollections that felt sharper in the context of the reopened investigation. One described noticing a delivery van parked unusually late outside the record shop during that season, a detail noted in 1999 interviews, though lacking formal documentation from 1983. Such observations contributed to a broader environmental understanding of the patterns surrounding the case. Investigators also reviewed residential proximity records from the early 1980s. The suspect had lived in an apartment complex only a short drive from Emily's route home, a connection that had appeared incidental during the original inquiry, but assumed greater meaning now. The geography of that area, particularly during winter months when early sunsets reduced visibility, provided an environment in which routine interactions could occur without attracting attention. The man's commute routes aligned with bus stops and sidewalks Emily often used. While none of these factors provided definitive evidence, together they created a meaningful reconstruction of opportunity. Detectives sought additional records from the distribution company. Among the documents were internal memos referencing seasonal route adjustments, including expanded deliveries during the holiday period of 1983 due to increased retail orders. The suspect had been assigned several of these expanded duties, positioning him near the record shop on an increased basis. His personnel file contained no disciplinary issues. However, an internal note indicated a brief request for schedule modification in early December 1983, citing personal matters. This date aligned closely with the period following Emily's disappearance. Such timing, while potentially coincidental, was viewed within the cumulative framework of emerging evidence. The letter from the time capsule remained the focal point of analysis. Linguistic specialists reviewed the phrasing, emphasizing its introspective tone, restrained emotionality, and careful wording. The narrative within the letter did not provide explicit admissions, but referenced a moment that could not be undone, and described leaving something behind near the water's edge in winter. Investigators revisited Baltimore's waterfront areas documented in the original search. While no physical evidence remained after so many years, the locations mentioned aligned with early theories that Emily's trajectory on the night she disappeared may have taken her toward the Harbor District, an area she sometimes visited with friends. The symbolic weight of referencing the waterfront further connected the letter to the geographic landscape of the case. With each development, the investigative team maintained a disciplined, methodical approach, aware that evidentiary standards required precision. The process of reconstructing a decades-old disappearance demanded careful integration of archival materials and contemporary forensic techniques. The winter landscape of Baltimore, with its persistent cold winds and intermittent snow, reinforced the atmosphere of a case emerging from years of stillness. The courthouse, where future proceedings might unfold, stored records from past decades in deep filing rooms that mirrored the gradual uncovering of forgotten details. By February 1999, investigators received authorization to search the suspect's property, including storage units he maintained. The search was conducted under strict procedural guidelines, ensuring the admissibility of any recovered items. Among the materials discovered in an older storage box were notebooks containing handwritten entries from the early 1980s. Many entries were mundane, referencing work schedules and personal errands. But one page, dated inconsistently and lacking clear headings, described an evening altered by a decision made too quickly, using phrasing reminiscent of the letter placed in the time capsule. Although not explicit, this note further connected the suspect's written expression to the tone and structure of the discovered envelope. Investigators also uncovered a set of photographs taken during community events in December 1983. In the background of one photograph, the suspect appeared near the record shop at a time not accounted for in his original statement to police. This contradicted the timeline he had provided in the early stages of the investigation. While the presence alone did not confirm wrongdoing, the discrepancy raised additional questions and strengthened the investigative narrative. Detectives met again with Emily's surviving family members in early 1999. The conversation remained measured, conveying developments without creating undue expectations. Family members expressed quiet resilience, shaped by years of uncertainty, but grounded in the now-present possibility of closure. They provided updated statements reflecting their memories of the weeks surrounding her disappearance, including references to her routine holiday preparations and plans to visit relatives during Christmas. These details added emotional context to the factual structure of the investigation. As the case evolved, investigators traced financial records connected to the suspect's delivery routes. An expense reimbursement form from late 1983 included mileage unaccounted for in route maps. The additional miles appeared to align with a detour near a wooded area originally searched during the early days of the case. While any physical evidence from that site had long since disappeared, The documentation supported a timeline consistent with unreported movement on the night Emily was last seen. By spring 1999, legal counsel became involved as the case approached a threshold where charges could be considered. Prosecutors reviewed the cumulative evidence, handwriting correlations, route placements, storage findings, timeline inconsistencies, and the symbolic yet significant letter. Although lacking physical forensic proof due to the age of the case, the circumstantial structure was increasingly cohesive. The standard for moving forward was carefully evaluated, acknowledging the weight of pursuing charges for an event that occurred more than 15 years prior. Public attention increased once authorities acknowledged that a suspect was under examination. Media coverage adopted a respectful tone, avoiding conjecture while highlighting the persistence of law enforcement. Winter transitioned into early spring, yet the seasonal imagery of the original disappearance remained central to public memory. Holiday lights reflecting on wet pavement, cold harbor winds, and the stark quiet of Baltimore nights in December. These details resurfaced in news coverage, reconnecting the community to the era from which the case originated. As prosecutors prepared for potential action, one final step remained: securing corroborating testimony from individuals who could speak to the suspect's behavior during the weeks surrounding the disappearance. Investigators located former coworkers and acquaintances from the early 1980s. One recalled the suspect displaying uncharacteristic anxiety after the start of December that year, a detail not reported previously. Another remembered him taking an unscheduled absence shortly after media coverage intensified in 1983. These accounts, while subjective, contributed to the broader understanding of behavioral shifts consistent with someone carrying the weight of concealed involvement. By mid-1999, the case had reached a pivotal stage. The investigative structure, once dormant, now stood fully rebuilt with interconnected evidence, forensic evaluation, and witness testimony. The time capsule letter, originally dismissed as an anomaly, had become the catalyst for uncovering a truth concealed beneath decades of holiday seasons, winter nights, and silent uncertainty. Baltimore's institutions prepared for the next phase, knowing the legal process would require the same precision and discipline that had guided the investigation to this point. As summer approached in 1999, the investigative momentum reached a critical threshold. Prosecutors, forensic specialists, and detectives convened repeatedly in the courthouse's older conference rooms, where thick brick walls and dim overhead lights created an atmosphere reflective of the gravity of revisiting a crime from the early 1980s. The architecture itself carried a sense of accumulated history, with decades of case files stored in adjoining rooms, each representing a path either resolved or lost to time. Within this environment, the case involving the disappearance of Emily Harrow progressed through final stages of review, aligning the evidence with legal standards required for prosecution without physical remains or direct forensic traces. The time capsule letter remained the centerpiece of the evidentiary narrative. Its placement within a sealed municipal project represented both premeditation and a desire for distant discovery. The linguistic patterns, handwriting consistencies, and temporal context all converged to reinforce its credibility as authored by the suspect. Combined with route logs, storage findings, and witness interviews, the letter formed the core of a circumstantial structure strong enough to initiate formal charges. Before proceeding, authorities sought additional verification from independent handwriting experts to ensure analytical consistency. 3 specialists reviewed the materials separately, each concluding that the handwriting on the letter and various 1983 documents originated from the same individual, with probability assessments considered significant under the standards of the time. While not conclusive in the absolute sense, these findings contributed critical weight. Before filing charges, investigators performed a final assessment of the suspect's movements during the critical period of late November and early December 1983. Archived gas receipts, handwritten route notes, and travel logs demonstrated deviations that aligned closely with estimates of when Emily would have been walking home from work. Investigators reconstructed the timeline with modern mapping tools, overlaying 1980s street layouts retrieved from urban planning archives. The analysis revealed that the suspect's claimed route on the night in question would not have justified the recorded mileage. Instead, the documented numbers suggested a detour consistent with passing through an area near abandoned industrial lots. These locations, though long redeveloped by the late 1990s, featured prominently in early search efforts when Emily first went missing. The alignment between route anomalies and historically significant search zones presented another piece of circumstantial coherence. Meanwhile, interviews with former delivery colleagues produced subtle but meaningful insights. One coworker recalled that during the winter of 1983, the suspect had occasionally driven additional miles between scheduled stops without clear justification. Another remembered that after the new year began in 1984, he appeared unusually subdued, withdrawing from casual workplace interaction. None of these accounts provided direct evidence, but their relevance emerged when placed within the larger investigative framework. Behavioral shifts following the incident time period, even when not formally documented at the time, supported a pattern of concealed anxiety. The decision to proceed with charges was made in late July 1999. Prosecutors filed an arrest warrant, citing evidence of kidnapping and homicide based on cumulative investigative findings. The arrest occurred quietly at the suspect's residence early in the morning, avoiding media presence. Officers transported him to the central booking facility, where initial processing followed standard procedures. The suspect maintained limited verbal response, declining to elaborate on his earlier statements, yet refraining from denying involvement outright. His legal counsel issued cautious, measured remarks regarding the absence of physical evidence, prepared to argue the limitations of a case built on documents and recollections more than 15 years old. Community reaction developed swiftly once the arrest became public. Baltimore residents who remembered the original disappearance expressed a mix of relief and cautious expectation. The story re-entered regional news cycles, often accompanied by winter archival footage from the 1983 search efforts. Images of volunteers combing through wooded areas, police cruisers navigating icy streets, and reporters standing outside the record shop returned to the public consciousness. The holiday context of Emily's disappearance, once a haunting detail in an unresolved case, now framed a narrative nearing accountability. Journalists revisited stored photographs of the Time Capsule project, illustrating how a community initiative intended to preserve history inadvertently held a hidden link to a long-forgotten crime. As legal proceedings began, prosecutors focused on constructing a coherent narrative that would withstand scrutiny despite the absence of direct physical evidence. They emphasized the unusual act of placing a reflective, guilt-laden letter inside a municipal capsule, arguing that such behavior demonstrated both consciousness of wrongdoing and belief that discovery would occur far in the future. Motive remained less defined, as the investigation produced no evidence of prior conflict between the victim and the suspect. Instead, prosecutors framed the incident as an opportunistic encounter facilitated by geographic and routine proximity. The suspect's delivery routes, frequent presence near the record shop, and familiarity with Emily's work schedule formed the foundational context. Defense counsel, in contrast, centered arguments on the ambiguity inherent in circumstantial evidence. They highlighted natural shifts in handwriting across decades, the potential for faulty memory among witnesses, and the speculative nature of interpreting personal writings discovered in storage boxes. They argued that the letter's wording was not explicitly incriminating and could be interpreted metaphorically. Efforts were made to compartmentalize each piece of evidence, framing them as individually insufficient and collectively inconclusive. Despite these challenges, prosecutors maintained confidence in the cumulative strength of the case. They presented the interconnected strands of evidence not as isolated anomalies, but as components of a structured timeline. Each document, witness recollection, and behavioral detail contributed to a portrait of actions that aligned with the disappearance. While the lack of physical remains posed an obstacle, historical cases, utilizing similar circumstantial frameworks, demonstrated that convictions could be secured when the totality of evidence surpassed reasonable doubt. As trial preparation continued, the family of Emily Harrow attended multiple briefings with prosecutors. The meetings were conducted with deliberate care, acknowledging the emotional difficulty inherent in revisiting the events of 1983. Family members described the shock of learning about the time capsule letter, expressing disbelief that such a small, seemingly symbolic container held the key to breaking a silence that had lasted through countless holiday seasons. The family's statements provided emotional weight within a case, defined largely by analytical reconstruction and procedural method. In October 1999, pretrial hearings commenced. The courthouse, with its creaking floors and high ceilings lined with aging ventilation grates, held an atmosphere shaped by both the gravity of the case and the patience required when handling decades-old evidence. Journalists gathered outside in small clusters, reporting on the legal arguments that unfolded inside. Prosecutors presented expert testimony on handwriting analysis, document preservation, and linguistic assessment. They described how ink degradation patterns confirmed the letter's age and offered insights into its placement inside the capsule prior to sealing in 1984. Defense counsel countered by questioning methodological reliability and emphasizing the absence of physical traces directly linking the suspect to harm. Throughout these proceedings, the suspect remained largely impassive, guided by legal advice to maintain minimal expression. His appearance, altered by age, contrasted sharply with the younger figure captured in 1983 photographs found among the Capsule Committee memorabilia. Observers noted a reserved, distant demeanor, neither acknowledging nor reacting to the frequent mention of Emily's name. As the scheduled trial date approached, the prosecution team reconstructed once more the timeline of the night Emily disappeared. They reviewed whether records confirming light snowfall that evening, creating the quiet streets and diminished foot traffic that contributed to a vulnerable environment. They re-examined bus schedules, streetlight coverage maps, and the proximity of delivery routes. These details created a reconstruction grounded in environmental realism, presenting the jury with a comprehensible sequence of events shaped by documented logistics rather than speculation. During this phase, detectives revisited storage units seized months earlier. Among the items not previously emphasized was a discarded pocket calendar from 1983 containing dates cryptically scratched out. Though not explicitly linked to the disappearance, the calendar's markings matched the approximate timeline of when investigators believed the suspect altered his routine. Document examiners analyzed erasure patterns and conclusively matched the pencil strokes to handwriting samples previously collected. This discovery, while modest in isolation, contributed additional circumstantial density. Finally, in early December 1999, the trial officially began. The date held symbolic weight, aligning with the anniversary of Emily's disappearance. The courtroom filled with observers, including members of the public who had followed the story since the original case. Holiday decorations appeared in distant hallways of the courthouse, contrasting with the somber tone of the proceedings. The prosecution opened by recounting the sequence of discovery, beginning with the unexpected unveiling of the time capsule. They emphasized the improbability of the letter's appearance and its thematic coherence with the suspect's personal notes. The defense countered by focusing on the necessity of proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt, reminding jurors that absence of physical evidence demanded heightened caution. Witnesses provided testimony over several days. Handwriting analysts explained methodological rigor, delivery coworkers described environmental context, and investigators walked the jury through the reconstructed timeline. The narrative remained focused, grounded in procedural detail and forensic evaluation. The family listened quietly from the gallery, maintaining the steady composure formed across the years of unanswered questions. As the trial progressed into its final stages, the jury faced the complex task of evaluating a case built on layered, interlocking components rather than singular definitive findings. The cumulative force of the evidence, however, created a structured, coherent account of the suspect's involvement in Emily's disappearance. With each piece fitting into a consistent framework, the prosecution's argument gained solidity. The closing arguments approached, marking the transition to the final phase of a process that had begun with a sealed capsule stored in a municipal basement. Baltimore's winter once again returned, echoing the season of the crime and underscoring the sense that years of uncertainty were nearing resolution. As closing arguments commenced in mid-December 1999, the tone inside the Baltimore courthouse reflected both the weight of the evidence and the passage of 16 winters since the night Emily Harrow disappeared. The prosecution framed its summation around the structure of accumulated detail. The handwritten letter concealed within a municipal time capsule, the corroborating handwriting exemplars found across delivery logs and personal notebooks, the inconsistencies in the suspect's original statements, and the reconstructed timeline placing him near Emily during the critical window of her disappearance. They presented each element not as isolated curiosities, but as components of a pattern that persisted across years and across every recovered document. The story built through these pieces, they argued, formed a coherent, legally sufficient account of what happened in late 1983. The defense, maintaining a firm stance on reasonable doubt, emphasized the absence of physical evidence, noting that no forensic material linked the suspect directly to Emily. They argued that memory-based testimony from individuals recalling events decades earlier risked inaccuracy, and they stressed that handwriting analysis, while probative, was not infallible. They suggested alternative explanations for the reflective tone of the time capsule letter, proposing that its phrasing could represent metaphorical introspection rather than confession. Defense counsel urged jurors to resist allowing the emotional gravity of an unresolved disappearance to override the standards required for conviction. The jury received instructions shortly before the Christmas season approached. Snow fell lightly on the courthouse steps as they deliberated, marking the quiet passage of time between discussions conducted behind closed doors. They reviewed documents, notes, and expert summaries, sifting through the structured layers of evidence assembled over the past year. The process extended across multiple days, with jurors requesting clarifications on handwriting methodology, delivery route records, and archival preservation details. Their diligence reflected the seriousness of judging a case whose origins reached back to a winter long past. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted to a focused stillness. Observers included members of the public who remembered the original missing person bulletins, former volunteers who had participated in the early 1980 search efforts, and the family who had endured years of silence. The verdict, delivered with steady formality, declared the suspect guilty on counts of kidnapping and second-degree murder. Though lacking direct forensic evidence, the jury determined that the cumulative force and coherence of the circumstantial case surpassed the threshold of reasonable doubt. The courtroom remained quiet as the verdict settled into collective awareness. Sentencing occurred several weeks later. The judge, referencing the sustained impact on the victim's family and the deliberate concealment implied by the time capsule letter, imposed a lengthy prison term consistent with mid-1990's sentencing guidelines for homicide cases involving long-delayed resolution. The decision underscored the legal system's recognition that the passage of time did not diminish accountability for violent acts. Reporters noted the solemn tone of the proceeding, emphasizing its contrast with the festive decorations visible in other parts of the courthouse, as Baltimore moved through another holiday season. With the conviction secured, investigators compiled a final chronological record of the case for archival preservation. The documentation described each step of the renewed inquiry, from the moment the sealed capsule was opened to the procedural milestones leading to trial. The time capsule letter, once an unexplained presence among children's drawings and school newsletters, remained stored under controlled conditions within the evidence facility. Its significance as the catalyst for reopening the case became a recurring reference in law enforcement discussions about the potential value of revisiting cold investigations through unconventional sources. In the months following the trial, detectives revisited locations connected to the original disappearance to produce a retrospective analysis for internal training. The industrial lots once suspected as potential sites of interest had long since been redeveloped, replaced by new commercial structures and parking areas. Yet the spatial relationships remained useful for examining how geographic routine can intersect with criminal opportunity. The record shop where Emily worked had closed years earlier, its former storefront now occupied by a different business. Still, its placement along the transit routes of the early 1980s provided essential context for understanding the environment in which the disappearance occurred. The Harrow family held a small, private gathering to acknowledge the resolution. Their reflections centered not on the trial itself, but on the lengthy process of living through uncertain winters, each passing holiday reinforcing the absence of their daughter. The conclusion of the case offered clarity rather than consolation, allowing them to anchor memories previously defined only by unanswered questions. Local news outlets reported respectfully on their statement, noting that closure in cases of long-term disappearance often arrives with a mixture of relief and enduring grief. In early 2000, prosecutors released a formal summary of the legal reasoning that supported the conviction. The document emphasized the orchestrated nature of the evidence, the rare circumstance of discovering a concealed letter that aligned with historical timelines, the analytical consistency across handwriting evaluations, and the significance of matching personal writings found in storage to the thematic content of the letter. They highlighted how circumstantial evidence, when meticulously structured, could form a comprehensive representation of events even in the absence of physical remains. The report was circulated among statewide law enforcement agencies as an instructive example of reactivating dormant cases. Within Baltimore's police department, the resolution of the case prompted a broader evaluation of archival systems. Captains overseeing cold case divisions conducted reviews of storage inventories, searching for documents or items previously overlooked due to misclassification or limited early 1980's record-keeping practices. Several cases saw renewed interest based on this audit, though none mirrored the unusual circumstances of a time capsule containing a key clue. The Harrow investigation served as a reminder that the convergence of archival preservation and investigative diligence could reveal pathways previously concealed by time. The convicted individual, now serving his sentence in a state correctional facility, filed appeals asserting improper interpretation of circumstantial evidence and challenging the admissibility of handwriting analysis. The appellate court reviewed transcripts, expert testimony, and procedural records. In 2001, the court upheld the conviction, citing the thorough, methodical approach taken by prosecutors and investigators. They concluded that the evidence, though indirect, formed an interconnected structure that reliably established the suspect's involvement in the disappearance and death of Emily Harrow. This decision reinforced the legal precedent that circumstantial cases can meet the burden of proof when their components align without contradiction. As the early 2000s progressed, the Harrow case became a point of study among criminal justice programs examining cold case methodologies. Professors used anonymized versions of the documentation to illustrate how long-term investigative persistence can converge with accidental preservation. Students analyzed the concept of delayed confession, embedded in the act of placing a letter into a sealed container designed for future discovery. The psychological implications of believing that truth could remain hidden until long after immediate consequences had passed offered researchers insight into offender behavior patterns. Baltimore's Historical Society, responsible for the original time capsule project, added a detailed annotation to its archive describing the unexpected role the capsule played in solving a homicide. While maintaining sensitivity to the nature of the case, they incorporated procedural records into their exhibition on municipal preservation efforts. The capsule itself, now permanently removed from public display, was referenced only through descriptive panels, ensuring that the focus remained on the lessons derived rather than the object itself. In the Harrow family's neighborhood, seasonal traditions resumed in the years following the conviction. Each winter, lights appeared on porches and along narrow residential streets, echoing the familiar patterns that defined Baltimore's December landscape. For some residents who had lived there since the 1980s, the sight of holiday decorations continued to evoke memories of the winter when the community first rallied to search for Emily. Yet the knowledge that answers finally emerged, even after years marked by uncertainty, shaped a narrative of collective endurance. Conversations about the case gradually shifted from speculation to reflection, acknowledging the persistence required to overcome silence and ambiguity. Within the police department, detectives who had worked on the renewed investigation occasionally referenced the experience when training new recruits. They emphasized that even minor archival anomalies, such as an unexplained envelope in a municipal capsule, warrant attention when aligned with case history. They described how procedural detail, environmental reconstruction, and documentary comparison formed the backbone of the renewed inquiry. The Harrow case became emblematic of the principle that cold cases may contain dormant solutions, embedded within overlooked records, rather than dramatic forensic breakthroughs. By the mid-2000s, the suspect remained in prison, with subsequent parole hearings consistently denied. Reports from correctional officials described him as largely withdrawn, participating minimally in programs but maintaining a consistent routine. He provided no further statements related to the disappearance, adhering to a pattern of limited disclosure that had persisted since the time of his arrest. His silence contributed little to the historical record, but affirmed the narrative established at trial. As the decades progressed, Baltimore continued to evolve, yet certain elements remained constant. The winter winds rolling off the harbor, the patterns of holiday lights illuminating older neighborhoods, and the archival rooms deep within municipal buildings where documents from past eras rested in orderly rows. Among those files, the Harrow case stood preserved in complete form, detailing not only the disappearance and conviction, but also the unusual mechanism by which the truth resurfaced. Investigators reviewing the case in later years noted how the smallest preserved artifact, a handwritten letter sealed away as part of a civic tradition, became the hinge on which the entire investigation turned. The lasting legacy of the case extended beyond legal resolution. It demonstrated the value of institutional memory, the importance of methodical archival practices, and the potential for dormant clues to gain meaning when examined through modern investigative frameworks. It highlighted the intersections between community history and investigative persistence, showing how everyday civic activities can inadvertently intersect with criminal truth. The case became a reminder that even as years accumulate and landscapes shift, the threads that connect events remain embedded within the documentary traces left behind. For the Harrow family, the resolution allowed their daughter's story to transition from an unsolved mystery to a documented chapter of Baltimore's criminal history. They continued to honor her life in private ways, choosing not to engage extensively with media after the conviction. Their reflections centered on preserving the memory of who she was rather than the circumstances of her disappearance. Community members who had participated in the original search sometimes placed small wreaths near locations associated with the early investigation during winter months, gestures symbolizing quiet remembrance rather than public ceremony. In the final assessment, the case of Emily Harrow illustrated how truth can emerge through unexpected channels, and how time, though capable of obscuring details, does not eliminate the possibility of resolution. The sealed container that held children's predictions and community memorabilia also preserved a moment of concealed confession. Its discovery, decades later, transformed an archive into an investigative lead, guiding detectives through a process defined by patience, precision, and respect for procedural integrity. When the case file was formally closed, it joined the ranks of solved cold cases housed within Baltimore's law enforcement system. Its documentation served as a testament to the endurance of investigative method, proving that even the quietest clues, those resting in darkness for years, can illuminate the path toward long-awaited closure.